Part 1 of Early Guides to the English Lake District. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Dr. Brown's letter, describing the vale and lake of Keswick. In my way to the north from Hagley, I passed through Dovedale, and to say the truth was disappointed in it. When I came to Buxton, I visited another or two of their romantic scenes, but these are inferior to Dovedale. They are but poor miniatures of Keswick, which exceeds them more in grandeur than I can give you to imagine, and more, if possible, in beauty than in grandeur. Instead of the narrow slip of valley which is seen at Dovedale, you have at Keswick a vast amphitheatre, in circumference above 20 miles. Instead of a meagre rivulet, a noble living lake, 10 miles round, of an oblong form, adorned with a variety of wooded islands. The rocks, indeed, of Dovedale are finely wild, pointed, and irregular, but the hills are both little and unanimated, and the margin of the brook is poorly edged with weeds, morass, and bushwood. But at Keswick you will on one side of the lake see a rich and beautiful landscape of cultivated fields rising to the eye in fine inequalities, with noble groves of oak happily dispersed, and climbing the adjacent hills, shade above shade, in the most various and picturesque forms. On the opposite shore you will find rocks and cliffs of stupendous height hanging broken over the lake in horrible grandeur, some of them 1,000 feet high, the woods climbing up their steep and shaggy sides, where mortal foot never yet approached. On these dreadful heights the eagles build their nests. A variety of waterfalls are seen pouring from their summits, and tumbling in vast sheets from rock to rock in rude and terrible magnificence, while on all sides of this immense amphitheatre the lofty mountains rise round, piercing the clouds in shapes as spiry and fantastic as the very rocks of Dovedale. To this I must add the frequent and bold projection of the cliffs into the lake, forming noble bays and promontories. In other parts they finely retire from it, and often open in abrupt chasms or clefts, through which at hand you see rich and cultivated vales, and beyond these at various distance, mountain rising over mountain, among which new prospects present themselves in mist, till the eye is lost in an agreeable perplexity, where active fancy travels beyond sense, and pictures things unseen. Were I to analyse the two places into their constituent principles, I should tell you that the full perfection of Keswick consists of 3 circumstances: beauty, horror, and immensity united, the second of which is alone found in Dovedale. Of beauty it hath little, nature having left it almost a desert. Neither its small extent nor the diminutive and lifeless form of the hills admit magnificence. But to give you a complete idea of these 3 perfections as they are joined in Keswick would require the united powers of Claude, Salvator, and Poussin. The first should throw his delicate sunshine over the cultivated vales, the scattered cots, the groves, the lake, and wooded islands. The second should dash out the horror of the rugged cliffs, the steeps, the hanging woods, and foaming waterfalls, while the grand pencil of Poussin should crown the whole with the majesty of the impending mountains. So much for what I would call the permanent beauties of this astonishing scene. Were I not afraid of being tiresome, I could now dwell as long on its varying or accidental beauties. I would sail round the lake, anchor in every bay, and land you on every promontory and island. I would point out the perpetual change of prospect, the woods, rocks, cliffs, and mountains, by turns vanishing or rising into view, now gaining on the sight, hanging over our heads in their full dimensions, beautifully dreadful, and now by a change of situation, assuming new romantic shapes, retiring and lessening on the eye, and insensibly losing themselves in an azure mist. I would remark on the contrast of light and shade produced by the morning and evening sun, the one gilding the western and the other the eastern side of this immense amphitheatre, while the vast shadow projected by the mountains buries the opposite part in a deep and purple gloom which the eye can hardly penetrate. The natural variety of colouring which the several objects produce is no less wonderful and pleasing, the ruling tints in the valley being those of azure, green, and gold, yet ever various, arising from an intermixture of the lake, the woods, the grass, and cornfields. These are finely contrasted by the grey rocks and cliffs, and the whole heightened by the yellow streams of light, the purple hues and misty azure of the mountains. Sometimes a serene air and clear sky disclose the tops of the highest hills, at others you see the clouds involving their summits, resting on their sides, or descending to their base and rolling among the valleys, as in a vast furnace. When the winds are high, they roar among the cliffs and caverns, like peals of thunder. Then, too, the clouds are seen in vast bodies sweeping along the hills in gloomy greatness, while the lake joins the tumult, and tosses like a sea. But in calm weather the whole scene becomes new. The lake is a perfect mirror, and the landscape in all its beauty, islands, fields, woods, rocks, and mountains, are seen inverted and floating on its surface. I will now carry you to the top of a cliff, where, if you dare approach the ridge, a new scene of astonishment presents itself, where the valley, lake, and islands seem lying at your feet, where this expanse of water appears diminished to a little pool amidst the vast immeasurable objects that surround it. For here the summits of more distant hills appear beyond those you have already seen, and rising behind each other in successive ranges and azure groups of craggy and broken steeps, form an immense and awful picture, which can only be expressed by the image of a tempestuous sea of mountains. Let me now conduct you down again to the valley, and conclude with one circumstance more, which is, that a walk by still moonlight, at which time the distant waterfalls are heard in all their variety of sound, among these enchanting dales, opens a scene of such delicate beauty, repose, and solemnity, as exceeds all description. End of Part 1. Part 2 of Early Guides to the English Lake District. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Extract from Dr. Dalton's descriptive poem, enumerating the beauties of the Lake of Keswick, first printed in 1755. See Purch's collection of poems. To nature's pride, sweet Keswick's vale, the Muse will guide. The Muse, who trod th' enchanted ground, who sailed the wondrous lake around, with you will haste once more to hail the beauteous brook of Borrowdale. From savage parent, gentle stream, be thou the Muse's favourite theme. O soft insinuating glide, silent along the meadow's side, smooth o'er the sandy bottom pass, resplendent all through fluid glass. Unless upon thy yielding breast their painted heads the lilies rest, to where, in deep capacious bed, the widely liquid lake is spread. Let other streams rejoice to roar down the rough rocks of dreaded Lodore, rush raving on with boisterous sweep, and foaming rend the frighted deep. Thy gentle genius shrinks away from such a rude, unequal fray. Through thine own native dale, where rise tremendous rocks amid the skies, thy waves with patience slowly wind, till they the smoothest channel find. Soften the horrors of the scene, and through confusion flow serene. Horrors like these at first alarm, but soon with savage grander charm, and raise to noblest thoughts the mind. Thus by thy fall, Lodore, reclined, the craggy cliff, impendent wood, whose shadows mix o'er half the flood, the gloomy clouds which solemn sail, scarce lifted by the languid gale, o'er the capped hill and darkened vale. The ravening kite and bird of Jove, which round the aerial ocean rove, and, floating on the billowy sky, with full expanded pinions fly, their fluttering or their bleating prey, thence with death-dooming eye survey. Channels by rocky torrents torn, rocks to the lake in thunder borne, or such as o'er our heads appear, suspended in their mid-career, to start again at his command, who rules fire, water, air, and land. I view with wonder and delight a pleasing, though an awful sight, for seen with them, the verdant isles soften with more delicious smiles, more tempting twine their opening bowers, more lively glow the purple flowers. More smoothly slopes the border gay, in fairer circles bends the bay, and last, to fix our wandering eyes, thy roofs, O Keswick, bright arise, the lake and lofty hills between, where giant Skiddaw shuts the scene. End of Part 2. Part 3 of Early Guides to the English Lake District. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. A description of Dunald Mill Hole by Mr. A. W. Taken from the Annual Register for 1760. Lancaster, August the 26th, 1760. Last Sunday I visited a cavern about 5 miles from hence, near the road to Kirby Lonsdale, called Dunald Mill Hole, a curiosity, I think, inferior to none of the kind in Derbyshire, which I have also seen. It is on the middle of a large common, and we are led to it by a brook, nearly as big as the New River, which, after turning a corn mill, just at the entrance to the cave, runs in at its mouth by several beautiful cascades, continuing its course 2 miles under a large mountain, and at last making its appearance again near Carnforth, a village in the road to Kendal. The entrance of this subterraneous channel has something most pleasingly horrible in it. From the mill at the top you descend for about 10 yards perpendicular, by means of chinks in the rocks and shrubs of trees. The road is then almost parallel to the horizon, leading to the right, a little winding, till you have some hundreds of yards thick of rocks and mineral above you. In this manner we proceeded, sometimes through vaults so capacious we could not see either roof or sides, and sometimes on all 4 from its narrowness, still following the brook, which entertained us with a sort of harmony well suiting the place, for the different height of its falls were as so many keys of music, which all being conveyed to us by the amazing echo, greatly added to the majestic horror which surrounded us. In our return we were more particular in our observations. The beautiful lakes formed by the brook in the hollow part of the cavern realized the fabulous Styx, and the murmuring falls from one rock to another broke the rays of our candles, so as to form the most romantic vibrations and appearances upon the variegated roof. The sides too are not less remarkable for fine colouring. The damp, the creeping vegetables, and the seams in the marble and limestone parts of the rock make as many tints as are seen in the rainbow, and are covered with a perpetual varnish from the just weeping strings that trickle from the roof. The curious in grottos, cascades, etc., might here obtain a just taste of nature. When we arrived at the mouth, and once more hailed all cheering daylight, I could not but admire the uncouth manner in which nature has thrown together those huge rocks which compose the arch over the entrance, but, as if conscious of its rudeness, she has clothed it with trees and shrubs of the most various and beautiful verdure, which bend downwards, and with their leaves cover all the rugged parts of the rock. As I have never met with an account of this place in any other author, I therefore think it the greater curiosity, but its obscure situation I take to be the reason. End of Part 3. Part 4 of Early Guides to the English Lake District. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Mr. Gray's Journal. In a letter to Dr. Warton, October 18th, 1769. Published in the Memoirs of his Life by Mr. Mason. I hope you got safe and well home after that troublesome night. Footnote. Dr. Warton, who had intended to accompany Mr. Gray to Keswick, was seized at Brough with a violent fit of his asthma, which obliged him to return home. This was the reason that Mr. Gray undertook to write the following journal of his tour for his friend's amusement. He sent it under different covers. I give it here in continuation. It may not be amiss, however, to hint to the reader that if he expects to find elaborate and nicely turned periods in this narration, he will be greatly disappointed. When Mr. Gray described places, he aimed only to be exact, clear, and intelligible, to convey peculiar, not general ideas, and to paint by the eye, not the fancy. There have been many accounts of the Westmoreland and Cumberland lakes, both before and since this was written, and all of them better calculated to please readers who are fond of what they call fine writing. Yet those who can content themselves with an elegant simplicity of narrative will, I flatter myself, find this to their taste. They will perceive it was written with a view rather to inform than to surprise, and if they make it their companion when they take the same tour, it will enhance their opinion of its intrinsic excellence. In this way I tried it myself before I resolved to print it. End of footnote. I long to hear you say so. For me, I have continued well, been so favoured by the weather that my walks have never once been hindered till yesterday. That is a fortnight and 3 or 4 days, and a journey of more than 300 miles. I am now at Aston for 2 days. Tomorrow I go to Cambridge. Mason is not here, but Mr. Alderson receives me. According to my promise, I send you the first sheet of my journal, to be continued without end. September the 30th. A mile and a half from Brough, where we parted on a hill, lay a great army encamped. Footnote. There is a great fair for cattle kept on the hill near Brough on this and the preceding day. End of footnote. To the left opened a fine valley, with green meadows and hedgerows, a gentleman's house peeping forth from a grove of old trees. On a nearer approach appeared myriads of cattle and horses in the road itself, and in all the fields round me a brisk stream hurrying across the way. Thousands of clean, healthy people in their best party-coloured apparel, farmers and their families, esquires and their daughters, hastening up from the dales and down the fells from every quarter, glittering in the sun and pressing forward to join the throng, while the dark hills on whose tops the mists were yet hanging served as a contrast to this gay and moving scene, which continued for near 2 miles more along the road, and the crowd, coming towards it, reached on as far as Appleby. On the ascent of the hill above Appleby, the thick hanging wood and the long reaches of the Eden, clear, rapid, and full as ever, winding below with views of the castle and town, gave much employment to the mirror. Footnote. Mr. Gray carried usually with him on these tours a plano-convex mirror of about 4 inches diameter on black foil, and bound up like a pocket-book. A glass of this sort is perhaps the best and most convenient substitute for a camera obscura of anything that has hitherto been invented, and may be had of any optician. End of footnote. But now the sun was wanting, and the sky overcast. Oats and barley cut everywhere, but not carried in. Past Kirby Shore, Sir William Dalston's house at Acorn Bank, Winfield Park, Harthorn Oaks, Countess Pillar, Broome Castle, Mr. Brown's large new house, crossed the Eden and the Eamont with its green vale, and dined at 3 o'clock with Mrs. Buchanan at Penrith on trout and partridge. In the afternoon walked up Beacon Hill a mile to the top, and could see Ullswater through an opening in the bosom of that cluster of broken mountains which the doctor well remembers. Winfield and Lowther Parks, etc., and the craggy tops of 100 nameless hills. These lie to the west and south. To the north, a great extent of black and dreary plains. To the east, Cross Fell, just visible through mists and vapours hovering round it. October 1st. A grey autumnal day, the air perfectly calm and mild. Went to see Ullswater, 5 miles distant. Soon left the Keswick road and turned to the left through shady lines along the vale of Emont, which runs rapidly on near the way, rippling over the stones. To the right is Dalemain, a large fabric of pale red stone, with 9 windows in front and 7 on the side, built by Mr. Hassel. Behind it, a fine lawn surrounded by woods and a long rocky eminence rising over them. A clear and brisk rivulet runs by the house to join the Emont, whose course is in sight and at a small distance. Further on appears Hutton St. John, a castle-like old mansion of Mr. Huddleston. Approached Dunmallet, a fine pointed hill covered with wood, planted by old Mr. Hassel before mentioned, who lives always at home and delights in planting. Walked over a spongy meadow or two, and began to mount the hill through a broad straight green alley among the trees, and with some toil gained the summit. From hence saw the lake opening directly at my feet, majestic in its calmness, clear and smooth as a blue mirror, with winding shores and low points of land covered with green enclosures, white farmhouses looking out among the trees, and cattle feeding. The water is almost everywhere bordered with cultivated lands, gently sloping upwards from a mile to a quarter of a mile in breadth, till they reach the feet of the mountains, which rise very rude and awful with their broken tops on either hand. Directly in front, at better than 3 miles distance, Place Fell, one of the bravest among them, pushes its bold broad breast into the midst of the lake, and forces it to alter its course, forming first a large bay to the left, and then bending to the right. I descended Dunmallet again by a side avenue that was only not perpendicular, and came to Barton Bridge above the Emont. Then, walking through a path in the wood round the bottom of the hill, came forth where the Emont issues out of the lake, and continued my way along its western shore close to the water, and generally on a level with it. Saw a cormorant flying over it and fishing. The figure of the lake nothing resembles that laid down in our maps. It is 9 miles long, and at widest under a mile in breadth. After extending itself 3 miles and a half in a line to south-west, it turns at the foot of Place Fell, almost due west, and is here not twice the breadth of the Thames at London. It is soon again interrupted by the root of Helvellyn, a lofty and very rugged mountain, and spreading again, turns off to the south-east, and is lost among the deep recesses of the hills. To this second turning I pursued my way about 4 miles along its border, beyond a village scattered among trees, and called Water Millock, in a pleasant grave day, perfectly calm and warm, but without a gleam of sunshine. Then the sky seeming to thicken, and the valley to grow more desolate, and the evening drawing on, I returned by the way I came to Penrith. October 2nd. I set out at 10 for Keswick by the road we went in 1767. Saw Greystock town and castle to the right, which lie about 3 miles from Ullswater over the fells. Passed through Penruddock and Threlkeld at the foot of Saddleback, whose furrowed sides were gilt by the noonday sun, whilst its brow appeared of a sad purple from the shadow of the clouds as they sailed slowly by it. The broad and green valley of Gardys and Lowside, with a swift stream glittering among the cottages and meadows, lay to the left, and the much finer but narrower valley of St. John's opening into it. Hilltop, the large though low mansion of the Gasgarths, Our farmhouse, seated on an eminence among woods, under a steep fell, was what appeared the most conspicuous, and beside it a great rock like some ancient tower nodding to its fall. Passed by the side of Skiddaw and its cub called Latrig, and saw from an eminence at 2 miles distance the vale of Elysium in all its verdure, the sun then playing on the bosom of the lake, and lighting up all the mountains with its lustre. Dined by 2 o'clock at the Queen's Head, and then straggled out alone to the parsonage, where I saw the sunset in all its glory. October 3rd. A heavenly day. Rose at 7 and walked out under the conduct of my landlord to Borrowdale. The grass was covered with a hoar-frost, which soon melted and exhaled in a thin bluish smoke, crossed the meadows, obliquely catching a diversity of views among the hills over the lake and islands, and changing prospect at every 10 paces. Left Cock's Hut, which we formerly mounted, and Castle Hill, a loftier and more rugged hill behind me, and drew near the foot of Wallaw Crag, whose bare and rocky brow cuts perpendicularly down above 400 feet, as I guess, though the people called it much more, awfully overlooks the way. Our path here tends to the left, and the ground gently rising and covered with a glade of scattering trees and bushes on the very margin of the water, opens both ways the most delicious view that my eyes ever beheld. Opposite are the thick woods of Lord Egremont and Newland Valley, with green and smiling fields embosomed in the dark cliffs. To the left the jaws of Borrowdale, with that turbulent chaos of mountain behind mountain rolled in confusion. Beneath you and stretching far away to the right, the shining purity of the lake reflecting rocks, woods, fields, and inverted tops of hills, just ruffled by the breeze, enough to show it is alive, with the white buildings of Keswick, Crosthwaite Church, and Skiddaw for a background at a distance. Behind you the magnificent heights of Wallaw Crag. Here the glass played its part divinely. The place is called Calf Close Reeds, and I chose to set down these barbarous names, that anybody may acquire on the place and easily find the particular station that I mean. This scene continues to Barrowgate, and a little farther. Passing a brook called Barrowbeck, we entered Borrowdale. The crags named Lodore Banks begin now to impond terribly over your way, and more terribly when you hear that 3 years since an immense mass of rock tumbled at once from the brow and barred all access to the dale, for this is the only road, till they could work their way through it. Luckily no one was passing by at the time of this fall, but down the side of the mountain and far into the lake lie dispersed the huge fragments of this ruin in all shapes and in all directions. Something farther we turned aside into a coppice, ascending a little in front of Lodore waterfall. The height appeared to be about 200 feet, the quantity of water not great, though, these 3 days excepted, it had rained daily in the hills for nearly 2 months before. But then the stream was nobly broken, leaping from rock to rock and foaming with fury. On one side a towering crag that spired up to equal, if not overtop, the neighbouring cliffs. This lay all in shade and darkness. On the other hand a rounder, broader, projecting hill, shagged with wood and illuminated by the sun, which glanced sideways on the upper part of the cataract. The force of the water, wearing a deep channel in the ground, hurries away to join the lake. We descended again and passed the stream over a rude bridge. Soon after we came under Gowdar Crag, a hill more formidable to the eye and to the apprehension than that of Lodore. The rocks at the top, deep cloven perpendicularly by the rains, hanging loose and nodding forwards, seem just starting from their base in shivers. The whole way down and the road on both sides is strewed with piles of the fragments strangely thrown across each other, and of a dreadful bulk. The place reminds me of those passes in the Alps, where the guides tell you to move on with speed and say nothing, lest the agitation of the air should loosen the snows above, and bring down a mass that would overwhelm a caravan. I took their counsel here, and hastened on in silence. Non ragioniam de lor, ma guarda, e passa. The hills here are clothed all up to their steep sides with oak, ash, birch, holly, etc. Some of it has been cut 40 years ago, some within these 8 years, yet all is sprung again, green, flourishing, and tall for its age, in a place where no soil appears but the staring rock, and where a man could scarce stand upright. Here we met a civil young farmer, overseeing his reapers, for it is now oat harvest, who conducted us to a neat white house in the village of Grange, which is built on a rising ground in the midst of a valley. Round it the mountains form an awful amphitheatre, and through it obliquely runs the Derwent, clear as glass, and showing under its bridge every trout that passes. Beside the village rises a round eminence of a rock covered entirely with old trees, and over that more proudly towers Castle Crag, invested also with wood on its sides, and bearing on its naked top some traces of a fort, said to be Roman. By the side of this hill, which almost blocks up the way, the valley turns to the left and contracts its dimensions till there is hardly any road but the rocky bed of the river. The wood of the mountains increases, and their summits grow loftier to the eye, and of more fantastic forms. Among them appear Eagle's Clift, Dove's Nest, Whitedale Pike, etc., celebrated names in the annals of Keswick. The dale opens about 4 miles higher till you come to Seathwaite, where lies the way, mounting the hills to the right that leads to the wad mines. All farther access is here barred to prying mortals. Only there is a little path winding over the fells, and for some weeks in the year passable to the dalesmen. But the mountains know well that these innocent people will not reveal the mysteries of their ancient kingdom. The reign of chaos and old night. Only I learned that this dreadful road, dividing again, leads one branch to Ravenglass, and the other to Hawkshead. For me, I went no farther than the farmer's, better than 4 miles from Keswick, at Grange. His mother and he brought us butter, that Cicero would have jumped at, though not in a lordly dish, bowls of milk, thin oaten cakes, and ale, and we had carried a cold tongue thither with us. Our farmer was himself the man that last year plundered the Eagle's eyrie. All the Dale are up in arms on such an occasion, for they lose abundance of lambs yearly, not to mention hares, partridges, grouse, etc. He was let down from the cliff in ropes to the shelf of the rock on which the nest was built, the people above shouting and hallooing to fright the old birds, which flew screaming round, but did not dare to attack him. He brought off the eaglet, for there is rarely more than one, and an addle egg. The nest was roundish, and more than a yard over, made of twigs twisted together. Seldom a year passes but they take the brood or eggs, and sometimes they shoot one, sometimes the other parent, but the survivor has always found a mate, probably in Ireland, and they breed near the old place. By his description I learned that this species is the ern, the vulture, Abicilla of Linnaeus, in his last edition, but in yours, Falco Abicilla. So consult him and Pennant about it. We returned leisurely home the way we came, but saw a new landscape. The features indeed were the same in part, but many new ones were disclosed by the midday sun, and the tints were entirely changed. Take notice this was the best, or perhaps the only day for going up Skiddaw, but I thought it better employed. It was perfectly serene and hot as midsummer. In the evening I walked alone down to the lake by the side of Crow Park after sunset, and saw the solemn colouring of the night draw on, the last gleam of sunshine fading away on the hilltops, the deep serene of the waters, and the long shadows of the mountains thrown across them till they nearly touched the hithermost shore. At a distance were heard the murmurs of many waterfalls, not audible in the daytime. I wished for the moon, but she was dark to me and silent, hid in her vacant interlunar cave. October 4th. I walked to Crow Park, now a rough pasture, once a glade of ancient oaks, whose large roots still remain in the ground, but nothing has sprung from them. If one single tree had remained, this would have been an unparalleled spot, and Smith judged right when he took his print of the lake from hence, for it is a gentle eminence, not too high, on the very margin of the water, and commanding it from end to end, looking full into the gorge of Borrowdale. I prefer it even to Cockshut Hill, which lies beside it, and to which I walked in the afternoon. It is covered with young trees both sown and planted, oak, spruce, Scotch fir, etc., all which thrive wonderfully. There is an easy ascent to the top, and the view far preferable to that on Castle Hill, which you remember, because this is lower and nearer to the lake, for I find all points that are much elevated spoil the beauty of the valley, and make its parts, which are not large, look poor and diminutive. Footnote: the picturesque point is always thus low in all prospects, a truth which, though the landscape painter knows he cannot always observe, since the patron who employs him to take a view of his place usually carries him to some elevation for that purpose, in order, I suppose, that he may have more of him for his money. Yet when I say this, I would not be thought to mean that a drawing should be made from the lowest point possible, as for instance, in this very view, from the lake itself, for then a foreground would be wanting. On this account, when I sailed on Derwent Water, I did not receive so much pleasure from the superb amphitheatre of mountains around me, as when, like Mr. Gray, I traversed its margin, and therefore think he did not lose much by not taking boat. End of footnote. While I was here, a little shower fell, red clouds came marching up the hills from the east, and part of a bright rainbow seemed to rise along the side of Castle Hill. From hence I got to the parsonage a little before sunset, and saw in my glass a picture that if I could transmit it to you, and fix it in all the softness of its living colours, would fairly sell for £1,000. This is the sweetest scene I can yet discover in point of pastoral beauty. The rest are in a sublimer style. October 5th. I walked through the meadows and cornfields to the Derwent, and crossing it went up to How Hill. It looks along Bassenthwaite Water, and sees at the same time the course of the river, and a part of the upper lake with a full view of Skiddaw. Then I took my way through Portingscale village to the park, a hill so called, covered entirely with wood. It is all a mass of crumbling slate. Passed round its foot between trees and the edge of the water, and came to a peninsula that juts out into the lake and looks along it both ways. In front rises Wallaw Crag and Castle Hill, the town, the road to Penrith, Skiddaw and Saddleback. Returning, met a brisk and cold north-eastern blast that ruffled all the surface of the lake and made it rise in little waves that broke at the foot of the wood. After dinner, walked up the Penrith road 2 miles or more, and turning into a cornfield to the right, called Castle Rig, saw a druid circle of large stones, 108 feet in diameter, the biggest not 8 feet high, but most of them still erect. They are 50 in number. Footnote: see this piece of antiquity more fully described, with a plate annexed, by Mr. Pennant in his second tour to Scotland in 1772, page 38. End of footnote. The valley of St. John's appeared in sight, and the summits of Catchidicam, called by Camden Casticand, and Helvellyn, said to be as high as Skiddaw, and to rise from a much higher base. October 6th. Went in a chaise 8 miles along the east side of Bassenthwaite Water to Ouse Bridge. The road in some parts made, and very good, the rest slippery and dangerous cart road, or narrow rugged lanes, but no precipices. It runs directly along the foot of Skiddaw, opposite to Widhope Brows. clothed to the top with wood. A very beautiful view opens down to the lake, which is narrower and longer than that of Keswick, less broken into bays, and without islands. Footnote. It is somewhat extraordinary that Mr. Gray omitted to mention the islands on Derwent Water, one of which I think they call the Vicar's Island, makes a principal object in the scene. See Smith's view of Derwent Water. End of footnote. At the foot of it, a few paces from the brink, gently sloping upwards, stands Armathwaite in a thick grove of Scotch firs, commanding a noble view, directly up the lake. At a small distance behind the house is a large extent of wood, and still behind this a ridge of cultivated hills, on which, according to the Keswick proverb, the sun always shines. The inhabitants here, on the contrary, call the vale of Derwent Water the Devil's Chamber Pot, and pronounce the name of Skiddaw Fell, which terminates here, with a sort of terror and aversion. Armathwaite's house is a modern fabric, not large, and built of dark red stone, belonging to Mr. Spedding, whose grandfather was steward to old Sir James Lowther, and bought this estate of the Hymers. The sky was overcast and the wind cool, so after dining at a public house which stands here near the bridge that crosses the Derwent just where it issues from the lake, and sauntering a little by the waterside, I came home again. The turnpike is finished from Cockermouth hither, 5 miles, and is carrying on to Penrith. Several little showers to-day. A man came in who said there was snow on Cross Fell this morning. October the 7th. I walked in the morning to Crow Park, and in the evening up Penrith Road. The clouds came rolling up the mountains, all round very dark, yet the moon shone at intervals. It was too damp to go towards the lake. Tomorrow I mean to bid farewell to Keswick. Botany might be studied here to great advantage at another season, because of the great variety of soils and elevations, all lying within a small compass. I observed nothing but several curious lichens, and plenty of gale or Dutch myrtle perfuming the borders of the lake. This year the Wad mine had been opened, which is done once in 5 years. It is taken out in lumps, sometimes as big as a man's fist, and will undergo no preparation by fire, not being fusible. When it is pure, soft, black, and loose-grained, it is worth sometimes 30 shillings a pound. There are no char ever taken in these lakes, but plenty in Buttermere Water, which lies a little way north of Borrowdale, about Martinmas, which are potted here. They sow chiefly oats and big here, which are now cutting and still on the ground. The rains have done much hurt, yet observe, the soil is so thin and light that no day has passed in which I could not walk out with ease, and you know I am no lover of dirt. Fell mutton is now in season. For about 6 weeks it grows fat on the mountains, and nearly resembles venison. Excellent pike and perch, here called bass. Trout is out of season, partridge in great plenty. October the 8th. I left Keswick and took the Ambleside road in a gloomy morning, and about 2 miles from the town, rather a mile, mounted an eminence called Castle Rig, and the sun breaking out discovered the most enchanting view I have yet seen of the whole valley behind me, the 2 lakes, the river, the mountains in all their glory, so that I had almost a mind to have gone back again. The road in some few parts is not completed, yet good country road, through sound but narrow and stony lanes, very safe in broad daylight. This is the case about Causeway Foot, and among Naddlefells to Langthwaite. The vale you go in has little breadth, the mountains are vast and rocky, the fields little and poor, and the inhabitants are now making hay, and see not the sun by 2 hours in a day, so long as at Keswick. Came to the foot of Helvellyn, along which runs an excellent road, looking down from a little height on Leith's Water, called also Thirlmere or Wyburn Water, and soon descending on its margin. The lake looks black from its depth, and from the gloom of the vast crags that scowl over it, though really clear as glass. It is narrow and about 3 miles long, resembling a river in its course, little shining torrents hurrying down the rocks to join it, but not a bush to overshadow them or cover their march. All is rock and loose stones up to the very brow, which lies so near your way, that not above half the height of Helvellyn can be seen. Next I passed by the little chapel of Wyburn, out of which the Sunday congregation were then issuing. Soon after a beck near Dunmail Rise, where entered Westmoreland for a second time, and now began to see Holme Crag, distinguished from its rugged neighbours, not so much by its height as by the strange broken outlines of its top, like some gigantic building demolished, and the stones that composed it flung across each other in wild confusion. Just beyond it opens one of the sweetest landscapes that art ever attempted to imitate. The bosom of the mountains spreading here into a broad basin discovers in the midst of Grasmere water. Its margin is hollowed into small bays with bold eminences, some of rock, some of turf, that half conceal and vary the figure of the little lake they command. From the shore a low promontory pushes itself far into the water, and on it stands a white village with the parish church rising in the midst of it, hanging enclosures, cornfields, and meadows green as an emerald, with their trees and hedges and cattle fill up the whole space from the edge of the water, and just opposite to you is a large farmhouse at the bottom of a steep smooth lawn, embosomed in old woods which climb half-way up the mountain-side, and discover above them a broken line of crags that crown the scene. Not a single red tile, no gentleman's flaring house, or garden walls break in upon the repose of this little unsuspected paradise, but all is peace, rusticity, and happy poverty in its neatest, most becoming attire. The road winds here over Grasmere Hill, whose rocks soon conceal the water from your sight, yet it is continued along behind them, and contracting itself to a river, communicates with Rydal Water, another small lake, but of inferior size and beauty. It seems shallow too, for large patches of reeds appear pretty far within it. Into this vale the road descends. On the opposite banks large and ancient woods mount up the hills, and just to the left of our way stands Rydal Hall, the family seat of Sir Michael le Fleming, a large old-fashioned fabric, rounded with wood. Sir Michael is now on his travels, and all this timber far and wide belongs to him. Near the house rises a huge crag called Rydal Head, which is said to command a full view of Windermere, and I doubt it not, for within a mile, that the lake is visible even from the road. As to going up the crag, one might as well go up Skiddaw. I now reached Ambleside, 18 miles from Keswick, meaning to lie there, but on looking into the best bedchamber, dark and damp as a cellar, grew delicate, gave up Windermere in despair, and resolved I would go on to Kendal directly, 14 miles farther. Footnote: by not staying a little at Ambleside, Mr. Gray lost the sight of 2 magnificent cascades, the one not half a mile behind the inn, the other down Rydal Crag, where Sir Michael le Fleming is now making a pathway to the top of it. These, when I saw them, were in full torrent, whereas Lodo waterfall, which I visited in the evening of the very same day, was almost without a stream. Hence I conclude that this distinguished feature in the Vale of Keswick is like the most northern rivers, only in high beauty during bad weather. But his greatest loss was in not seeing a small waterfall, visible only through the window of a ruined summer-house in Sir Michael's orchard. Here nature has performed everything in little that she usually executes on her larger scale, and on that account, like the miniature painter, seems to have finished every part of it in a studied manner, not a little fragment of rock thrown into the basin, not a little stem of brushwood that starts from its craggy sides, but has its picturesque meaning, and the little central stream, dashing down a cleft of the darkest coloured stone, produces an effect of light and shadow beautiful beyond description. This little theatrical scene might be painted as large as the original, on a canvas not bigger than those usually dropped in the opera house. There is a cascade at Nunnery near Kirkoswald in Cumberland, much in the same style as this. The accompaniments are as beautiful, the basin larger, and the perpendicular fall 18 feet. End of footnote. The road in general, fine turnpike, but some parts, about 3 miles in all, not made, yet without danger. For this determination I was unexpectedly well rewarded, for the afternoon was fine, and the road, for the space of full 5 miles, ran along the side of Windermere, with delicious views across it, and almost from one end to the other. It is 10 miles in length, and at most a mile over, resembling the course of some vast and magnificent river, but no flat marshy grounds, no osier beds or patches of scrubby plantations on its banks. At the head 2 valleys open among the mountains, one, that by which we came down, the other Langdale, in which Wrynose and Hardknot, 2 great mountains, rise above the rest. From thence the fells visibly sink, and soften along its sides. Sometimes they run into it, but with a gentle declivity, in their own dark and natural complexion. Oftener they are green and cultivated, with farms interspersed, and round eminences, on the border covered with trees. Towards the south it seemed to break into large bays, with several islands and a wider extent of cultivation. The way rises continually, till at a place called Orristhead it turns south-east, losing sight of the water. Passed by Ing's Chapel and Staveley, but I can say no further, for the dusk of the evening coming on, I entered Kendal almost in the dark, and could distinguish only a shadow of the castle on a hill, and tenter grounds spread far and wide around the town, which I mistook for houses. My inn promised sadly, having 2 wooden galleries like Scotland in front of it. It was indeed an old, ill-contrived house, but kept by civil, sensible people, so I stayed 2 nights with them, and fared and slept very comfortably. October the 9th. The air mild as summer, all corn off the ground, and the skylark singing aloud. By the way, I saw not one at Keswick, perhaps because the place abounds in birds of prey. I went up the castle hill. The town chiefly consists of 3 nearly parallel streets, almost a mile long. Except these, all the other houses seem as if they had been dancing a country dance, and were out. There they stand back to back, corner to corner, some uphill, some down, without intent or meaning. Along by their side runs a fine brisk stream, over which there are 3 stone bridges. The buildings, a few comfortable houses excepted, are mean, of stone, and covered with a bad rough cast. Footnote: the accounts of things given by hasty travellers are generally inaccurate, and often injudicious. As to the principal streets of Kendal, they are neither 3 in number nor nearly parallel. They are but 2, one about a mile in length, and another of about half a mile. These streets contain indeed but few elegant houses. They are, however, on the whole as open and well built as in most other towns. As to the bad rough cast our author speaks of, judges of rough cast have always supposed this country no way deficient either in its materials or in the manner of laying it on. End of footnote. Near the end of the town stands a handsome house of Colonel Wilson's, and adjoining to it the church, a very large Gothic fabric, with a square tower. It has no particular ornaments but double aisles, and, at the east end, 4 chapels or choirs, one of the Parrs, another of the Stricklands. The third is the proper choir of the church, and the 4th of the Bellinghams, a family now extinct. There is an altar tomb of one of them dated 1577, with a flat brass, arms and quarterings, and in the window their arms alone, argent, a hunting horn, sable strung gules. In the Stricklands chapel several monuments, and another old altar tomb, not belonging to the family. On the side of it, a fesse density between 10 billets d'encore. In the Pars chapel is a third altar tomb in the corner. No figure or inscription, but on the side cut an escutcheon of Ross of Kendal, 3 water budgets, quartering par, 2 bars, in a bordure engrailed. Secondly, an escutcheon, vere, a fesse for Marmion. Thirdly, an escutcheon, 3 chevronels braced, and a chief, which I take for Fitzhugh. At the foot is an escutcheon, surrounded with the garter, bearing Ross and par quarterly, quartering the other 2 before mentioned. I have no books to look in, therefore cannot say whether this is the Lord Parr of Kendal, Queen Catherine's father, or her brother, the Marquis of Northampton. Perhaps it is a cenotaph for the latter, who was buried at Warwick in 1571. The remains of the castle are seated on a fine hill on the side of the river opposite the town. Almost the whole enclosure of the walls remains, with 4 towers, 2 square and 2 round, but their upper parts and embattlements are demolished. It is of rough stone and cement, without any ornament or arms, round, enclosing a court of like form, and surrounded by a moat. Nor ever could it have been larger than it is, for there are no traces of outworks. There is a good view of the town and river, with a fertile open valley through which it winds. After dinner I went along the Millthrop turnpike, 4 miles, to see the falls, or force of the river Kent. Came to Caesar, and turned down a lane to the left. This seat of the Stricklands, an old Catholic family, is an ancient hall-house, with a very large tower embattled. The rest of the buildings added to it are of a later date, but all is white and seen to advantage on a background of old trees. There is a small park also, well wooded. Opposite to this, turning to the left, I soon came to the river. It works its way in a narrow and deep rocky channel, overhung with trees. The calmness and brightness of the evening, the roar of the waters, and the thumping of huge hammers at an iron forge not far distant, made it a singular walk. But as to the falls, for there are 2, they are not 4 feet high. I went on down to the forge, and saw the demons at work by the light of their own fires. The iron is brought in pigs to Millthrop, by sea from Scotland, etc., and is here beat into bars and plates. 2 miles further, at Levens, is the seat of Lord Suffolk, where he sometimes passes the summer. It was a favourite place of his late Countess, but this I did not see. October the 10th. I proceeded by Burton to Lancaster, 22 miles, very good country, well enclosed and wooded, with some common interspersed. Passed at the foot of Farleton Knott, a high fell. 4 miles north of Lancaster, on a rising ground called Bowton, we had a full view of Cartmel sands, with here and there a passenger riding over them, it being low water, the points of Furness shooting far into the sea, and lofty mountains, partly covered with clouds, extending north of them. Lancaster also appeared very conspicuous and fine, for its most distinguished features, the castle and church, mounted on a green eminence, were all that could be seen. Woe is me! When I got thither, it was the 2nd day of their fair. The inn in the principal street was a great old gloomy house full of people, but I found tolerable quarters, and even slept 2 nights in peace. In a fine afternoon I ascended the castle hill. It takes up the higher top of the eminence on which it stands, and is irregularly round, encompassed with a deep moat. In front, towards the town, is a magnificent Gothic gateway, lofty and huge. The overhanging battlements are supported by a triple range of corbels, the intervals pierced through and showing the day from above. On its top rise light watch-towers of small height. It opens below with a grand pointed arch. Over this is a wrought tabernacle, doubtless once containing its founder's figure. On one side a shield of France, semi-quartered with England. on the other the same, with a label, Ermine, for John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster. This opens to a court within, which I did not much care to enter, being the county jail, and full of prisoners, both criminals and debtors. From this gateway the walls continue and join into a vast square tower of great height, the lower part at least of remote antiquity, for it has small round-headed lights, with plain short pillars on each side of them. There is a third tower, also square, and of less dimensions. This is all the castle. Near it, and but little lower, stands the church, a large and plain Gothic fabric. The high square tower at the west end has been rebuilt of late years, but nearly in the same style. There are no ornaments of arms, etc., anywhere to be seen. Within it is lightsome and spacious, but not one monument of antiquity or piece of painted glass is left. From the churchyard there is an extensive sea view, for now the tide had almost covered the sands and filled the river, and besides the greatest part of Furness, I could distinguish Peel Castle on the Isle of Fowdry, which lies off its southern extremity. The town is built on the slope, and at the foot of the castle hill, more than twice the bigness of Auckland, with many neat buildings of white stone, but a little disorderly in their position, and ad libitum, like Kendal. Many also extend below on the quays by the riverside, where a number of ships were moored, some of them three-masted vessels decked out with their colours in honour of the fair. Here is a good bridge of 4 arches over the Lune, that runs when the tide is out, in 2 streams divided by a bed of gravel, which is not covered but in spring tides. Below the town it widens to near the breadth of the Thames at London, and meets the sea at 5 or 6 miles distance to the south-west. October the 11th. I crossed the river and walked over a peninsula 3 miles to the village of Poulton, which stands on the beach. An old fisherman mending his nets, while I inquired about the danger of passing those sands, told me in his dialect a moving story, how a brother of the trade, a cockler as he styled him, driving a little cart with 2 daughters, women grown, in it, and his wife on horse, back following, set out one day to pass the 7-mile sands, as they had been frequently used to do, for nobody in the village knew them better than the old man did. When they were about half-way over, a thick fog rose, and as they advanced, they found the water much deeper than they expected. The old man was puzzled. He stopped, and said he would go a little way to find some mark he was acquainted with. They stayed a while for him, but in vain. They called aloud, but no reply. At last the young women pressed their mother to think where they were, and go on. She would not leave the place. She wandered about forlorn and amazed. She would not quit her horse and get into the cart with them. They determined, after much time wasted, to turn back and give themselves up to the guidance of their horses. The old woman was soon washed off and perished. The poor girls clung close to their cart, and the horse, sometimes wading and sometimes swimming, brought them back to land alive, but senseless with terror and distress, and unable for many days to give any account of themselves. The bodies of their parents were found the next ebb, that of the father a very few paces distant from the spot where he had left them. In the afternoon I wandered about the town, and by the quay till it grew dark. October the 12th. I set out for Settle by a fine turnpike road 29 miles through a rich and beautiful country, diversified with frequent villages and churches, very unequal ground, and on the left the river Lune winding in a deep valley, its hanging banks clothed with fine woods, through which you catch long reaches of the water as the road winds about at a considerable height above it. In the most picturesque part of the way I passed the park belonging to the Honourable Mr. Clifford, a Catholic. The grounds between him and the river are indeed charming. The house is ordinary, and park nothing but a rocky fell scattered over with ancient hawthorns. Footnote: this scene opens just 3 miles from Lancaster, on what is called the Queen's Road. To see the view in perfection, you must go into a field on the left. Here Ingleborough, behind a variety of lesser mountains, makes the background of this prospect. On each hand of the middle distance rise two sloping hills, the left clothed with thick woods, the right with variegated rock and herbage. Between them, in the richest of valleys, the Lune serpentises for many a mile, and comes forth ample and clear through a well-wooded and richly pastured foreground. Every feature which constitutes a perfect landscape of the extensive sort is here not only boldly marked, but also in its best position. When I came to Hornby, a little town on the river Wenning, over which a handsome bridge is now building, the castle, in a lordly situation, attracted me, so I walked up the hill to it. First presents itself a large white ordinary sashed gentleman's house, and behind it rises the ancient keep, built by Edward Stanley, Lord Monteagle. He died about 1529, in King Henry VIII's time. It is now only a shell. The rafters are laid within it as for flooring. I went up a winding stone staircase in one corner to the leads, and at the angle is a single hexagon watch-tower, rising some feet higher, fitted up in the taste of modern summer-house, with sash windows in gilt frames, a stucco cupola, and on the top a vast gilt eagle built by Mr. Charteris, the present possessor. He is the second son of the Earl of Wemyss, brother to the Lord Elcho, and grandson to Colonel Charteris, whose name he bears. From the leads of the tower there is a fine view of the country round, and much wood near the castle. Ingleborough, which I had seen before distinctly at Lancaster to north-east, was completely wrapped in clouds, all but its summit, which might have been easily mistaken for a long black cloud too, fraught with an approaching storm. Now our road began gradually to mount towards the Apennine, the trees growing less and thinner of leaves, till we came to Ingleton, 18 miles. It is a pretty village, situated very high, and yet in a valley at the foot of that huge monster of nature, Ingleborough. Two torrents cross it with great stones rolled along their beds instead of water, and over them are flung two handsome arches. The nipping air, though the afternoon was growing very bright, now taught us we were in Craven. The road was all up and down, though nowhere very steep. To the left were mountain tops, to the right a wide valley, all enclosed ground, and beyond it high hills again. In approaching Settle, the crags on the left drew nearer to our way, till we descended Brunton Brow into a cheerful valley, though thin of trees, to Giggleswick, a village with a small piece of water by its side, covered with coots. Near it a church which belongs also to Settle, and half a mile farther, having passed the Ribble over a bridge, I arrived there. It is a small market town, standing directly under a rocky fell. There are not in it above a dozen good-looking houses. The rest are old and low, with little wooden porticos in front. My inn pleased me much, though small, for the neatness and civility of the good woman that kept it. So I lay there 2 nights, and went October 13th, to visit the Goredale Scar, which lay 6 miles from Settle, but that way was directly over a fell, and as the weather was not to be depended on, I went round in a chaise, the only way one could get near it in a carriage, which made it full 13 miles, half of it such a road. But I got safe over it, so there's an end, and came to Malham, pronounced Maum, a village in the bosom of the mountains, seated in a wild and dreary valley. From thence I was to walk a mile over very rough ground, a torrent rattling along on the left hand. On the cliffs above hung a few goats. One of them danced and scratched an ear with its hind foot, in a place where I would not have stood stock still, for all beneath the moon. As I advanced the crags seemed to close in, but discovered a narrow entrance turning to the left between them. I followed my guide a few paces, and the hills opened again into no large space, and then all further way is barred by a stream that, at the height of about 50 feet, gushes from a hole in the rock, and spreading in large sheets over its broken front, dashes from steep to steep, and then rattles away in a torrent down the valley. The rock on the left rises perpendicular, with stubbed yew trees and shrubs starting from its sides, to the height of at least 300 feet. But these are not the thing. It is the rock to the right, under which you stand to see the fall, that forms the principal horror of the place. From its very base it begins to slope forward over you, in one black or solid mass, without any crevice in its surface, and overshadows half the area below its dreadful canopy. When I stood at, I believe, 4 yards distant from its foot, the drops which perpetually distill from its brow fell on my head, and in one part of its top, more exposed to the weather, there are loose stones that hang in the air, and threaten visibly some idle spectator with instant destruction. It is safer to shelter yourself close to its bottom, and trust to the mercy of that enormous mass, which nothing but an earthquake can stir. The gloomy, uncomfortable day well suited the savage aspect of the place, and made it still more formidable. I stayed there, not without shuddering, a quarter of an hour, and thought my trouble richly paid, for the impression will last for life. At the alehouse where I dined in Malham, Vivares, the landscape painter, had lodged for a week or more. Smith and Bellas had also been there, and 2 prints of Goredale have been engraved by them. October the 14th. Leaving my comfortable inn, to which I had returned from Goredale, I set out for Skipton, 16 miles. From several parts of the road, and in many places about Settle, I saw at once the 3 famous hills of this country, Ingleborough, Pennygant, and Pendle. The first is esteemed the highest, and their features not to be described but by the pencil. Craven, after all, is an unpleasing country when seen from a height. Its valleys are chiefly wide, and either marshy or enclosed pasture with a few trees. Numbers of black cattle are fatted here, both of the Scotch breed and a larger sort of oxen with great horns. There is little cultivated ground except a few oats. Skipton, to which I went through Long Preston and Gargrave, is a pretty large market town in a valley, with one very broad street gently sloping downwards from the castle which stands at the head of it. This is one of the good Countess's buildings. Anne, Countess of Pembroke and Montgomery. But on old foundations. It is not very large, but of a handsome antique appearance, with round towers. A grand gateway, bridge, and moat, surrounded by many old trees. It is in good repair, and kept up as the habitation of the Earl of Thanet, though he rarely comes thither. What with the sleet and a foolish dispute about chaises that delayed me, I did not see the inside of it, but went on 15 miles to Otley. First up Shode Bank, the steepest hill I ever saw a road carried over in England, for it mounts in a straight line, without any other repose for the horses than by placing stones every now and then behind the wheels, for a full mile. Then the road goes on a level along the brow of this high hill over Rumbald Moor, till it gently descends into Waldale, for they call the Vale of the Wharf, and a beautiful vale it is, well wooded, well cultivated, well inhabited, but with high crags at a distance, that border the green country on either hand. Through the midst of it, deep, clear, full to the brink, and of no inconsiderable breadth, runs in long windings the river. How it comes to pass that it should be so fine and copious a stream here, and at Tadcaster, so much lower, should have nothing but a wide stony channel without water, I cannot tell you. I passed through Long Addingham, Ilkley, pronounced Eakley, distinguished by a lofty brow of loose rocks to the right. Berkeley, a neat and pretty village among trees. On the opposite side of the river lay Middleton Lodge, belonging to a Catholic gentleman of that name. Weston, a venerable stone fabric, with large offices of Mr. Vavasour. the meadows in front gently descending to the water, and behind a great and shady wood. Farmley, Mr. Fawkes's, a place like the last, but larger, and rising higher on the side of the hill. Otley is a large airy town, with clean but low rustic buildings, and a bridge over the wharf. I went into its spacious Gothic church, which has been new roofed, with a flat stucco ceiling. In a corner of it is the monument of Thomas Lord Fairfax, and Helen Aske, his lady, descended from the Cliffords and Latimers, as her epitaph says. The figures are not ill cut, particularly his in armour, but bareheaded, lie on the tomb. I take them to be the parents of the famous Sir Thomas Fairfax. End of Part 4. Part 5 of Early Guides to the English Lake District. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Extract from a 6 months' tour through the north of England, by Arthur Young. Now, sir, for the glory of Keswick, its lake so famous all over England. Let me first inform you that it is by computation 10 miles round, of an oblong figure, and enclosed by a prodigious range of formidable mountains, of such a height that they are cloud-topped for several months in the year. The best way of viewing it is to row round the lake, and land now and then for catching the varieties of the prospect. You walk from the town first down to Cockshut Hill, a small rising ground within the amphitheatre of mountains, and has been lately planted. The view of the lake from hence is very beautiful. You have a most elegant sheet of water at your feet, of the finest colour imaginable, spotted with islands, of which you see 5, and are high enough to command the water around them. One is in the middle, of about 5 acres of grassland, with a house under a clump of trees on one side of it, the whole object beautifully picturesque. You look also upon another planted with Scotch firs, and also upon 3 others more distant. This is the view of the floor of this noble amphitheatre. The walls are in different style, sublime. To the left you look first on a hilly rock, partly covered with shrubby wood, and further on upon a chain of tremendous rocks, near 400 yards high. Their feet are spread with hanging woods, but their heads bare, broken and irregular. Following the line, the lake seems to lose itself among a wood of rocks and mountains, the tops rising one above another in the wildest manner imaginable. The opposite shore presents you a full view of a vast range of hills, and behind you look upon the prince of the surrounding mountains, Skiddaw, whose tremendous head rears above the clouds. Leaving this hill, you walk down to your boat, and are struck with the limpid transparency of the water, which almost exceeds belief. The bottom is quite paved with stones, and the white ones glitter through the tremulous curl of the surface like so many diamonds. You row to the left, pass a variety of shore, here rocky and projecting, there low and retiring, coast a planted island, and coming under Wallow Crag, one of the immense rocks before mentioned, you have from its foot a very fine view. The surrounding rocks and mountains are truly noble, the crag above you fringed about 1/3 of its height with pendant woods. The lake at your feet breaks beautifully into a bay behind a promontory called Stable Hills. Against it is Brampsholme Island, belonging to Greenwich Hospital, and over the low part of the promontory you catch the wood on Lord's Island in a very pleasing manner. The opposite shore is beautifully scattered with hanging woods, and some white houses give a liveliness to the view truly pleasing. Taking your boat again and rowing till you are opposite the opening between Wallow and Barrow Crags, the noise of a waterfall unseen will induce you to land again. Walking on to a little ruinous bridge, you look upon a romantic hollow of rocks and woods, with a stream pouring down the clefts in many sheets, and seen among the trees in the most picturesque manner. A romantic scene of rock and wood and water 30 feet high, Rowing from hence, under Barrow Crag, the shore is rocky and various. Passing some low ground and landing on a rising one, the view is exquisite. The water breaks in the most beautiful manner imaginable into bays and sheets, stretching away from the eye most gloriously between the Stable Hills, Lord's Island, and Vicar's Island. Brampsholme cuts in the middle, and St. Albans Isle presents his broad side to your full view. At the other end of the lake, the rising hills, part of cultivated, waving enclosures, and part of hanging woods, all scattered with white houses, and the whole crowned with the lofty mountains, are beautifully picturesque, and contrast finely with the view of the south end of the lake, around which the rocks and mountains are tremendously bold, pendant, and threatening. Following the coast, the shore is thinly fringed with wood. Then you row around a projecting land, containing several enclosures, and come under a fine, thick, hanging wood, with a raging torrent breaking through it, over rocks just seen between the wood and Barrowside, but heard in the most romantic manner. You next anchor in a bay, the environs of which are dreadful. You are under a monstrous craggy rock, Throng Crag, scattered with shrubby wood to the very edge, and almost perpendicular, and moving the eye from the formidable object, you find this end of the lake surrounded with a chain of them, in the boldest and abruptest style imaginable. The opposite shore of mountains very great, and noise of distant waterfalls heard most gloriously. From hence you coast a dreadful shore of fragments, which time has broken from the towering rocks, many of them of a terrible size, some stopped on the land by larger than themselves, and others rolled into the lake through a path of desolation, sweeping trees, hillocks, and everything to the water. The very idea of a small shiver against the boat strikes with horror. Advancing, you catch the view of a most beautiful waterfall within the wave of a gentle bend of the rocks, but to enjoy the full luxuriance of this exquisite landscape, it is necessary to land and walk to an opening in the grove, from whence it is seen in surprising beauty. You look up a tremendous wall of rock, perpendicular to the top, scattered with wood, that seems to hang in the air. A large stream rushes out of a cliff near the top, and falls, in the most broken and romantic manner, several 100 feet. It falls in one gush for several yards. The projecting part of the rock breaks it then into 3 streams, which are presently quite lost behind hanging woods. Lower down, you again catch it in a single bright sheet, among the surrounding dark wood, in the most elegantly picturesque manner that fancy can conceive. Losing itself again behind the intervening trees, it breaks to the view in various scattered streams, half seen, glittering in the sunbeams, among the branches of the trees, in the most bewitching colours of nature's clear obscure. Lower still, you again catch it united in one bright rushing fall, in the dark bosom of a fine hollow wood, which finishes the scene. The surrounding hills, rocks, and scattered pendant woods are all romantic and sublime, and tend nobly to set off this most exquisite touch of rural elegance. Following the coast, you sail round a sweet little island, a clump of wood growing out of the lake, but it is joined to the mainland when the water is very low. From hence, pursuing the voyage, you come into the narrow part of the lake, and have a full view of most romantic, terrible, craggy rocks, enclosing a most grand and beautiful cascade. It is a view that must astonish the spectator. You look up to 2 dreadful pointed rocks, of a vast height, which almost hang over your head, partly scattered with shrubby wood in the wildest taste of nature. Between them is a dreadful precipice of broken craggy rock, over which a raging torrent foams down in one vast sheet of water, several yards wide, just broken into ebullitions by the points of the rocks unseen. At another time I saw it, when the craggy rock appeared, and the stream was broken by it into several gushing torrents, which seemed to issue distinctly from clefts in the rock in the most picturesque manner imaginable. The water is lost in one spot, caught again in another, foaming out of this cleft with rushing impetuosity, and trickling down that with the most pleasing elegance. Nothing can be fancied more grand, more beautiful, or romantic. Taking a winding walk through the wood, it leads down to a rapid stream which you cross, and presently come to a new and most delicious scene. To the right you catch a side view of the fall just described, in a new direction, most beautifully embosomed in rock and hanging wood. Full in front you look upon another cascade, which rushes out, as it were, from the rotten stump of an old tree, and falling down an irregular surface of rock, it breaks into larger and more sheets, some full, others thin and trickling, a most sweet variety. After this it breaks again, and falls into the stream, in fresh beauty, elegantly romantic. Following the shore into Fleet water, you come into a region of most stupendous rocks, broken and irregularly pointed in the most abrupt and wild manner imaginable, with monstrous fragments, large as a house, that have tumbled from their heads, dreadful in the idea. Pursuing the water to its point, you come into a new and most glorious amphitheatre of rocks and mountains. On one side, craggy, broken, and wildly irregular, and on the other, a vast range of mountainside, the hollow magnificently great. Going up the river to Grange Bridge, under Grange Crag, the lake is lost, the prospect new and terrible, a whole sweep of rocks, crags, mountains, and dreadful chasms. Leaving the boat and walking up to the village, you gain a view of a cone-like rocky woody hill, rising in the midst of a hollow of mountains, most nobly romantic. From hence, following the road to the lake under Brandelow Hill, you have the noblest view of rocks and hills in the world. Grange Crag and Crown Head appear in full view, surrounded by an immense wall of rock and mountain, the effect astonishingly great. Taking boat again, you row round a prodigious fine promontory, beautifully wooded, and upon turning it, you tack about round a most exquisite little island in the bay, and if the water is very high, there are two more very fine woody islands, around which you may row. This little archipelago will entertain a person of the least taste. Nor is the view of the lake's environs unworthy of admiration. The crags and cliffs to the right are tremendous. Skiddaw fronts you in the sublimest style. Saddleback, on one side of him, rears his head in the boldest manner. To the left you look upon an exceeding fine hanging wood, beautifully spread over a waving hill. Advancing with the coast, you next land at the lead mines, which, if you have a taste for grotto work, will entertain, as a boat may be loaded with spar of various glittering and beautiful kinds. Here also are two curiosities of an uncommon kind, viz., two salt springs. Sailing along the shore, it leads you under a noble hill, most beautifully spread with wood. It is covered thick with young timber trees, which grow in the most picturesque manner down to the very water's edge. You next enter a little bay, and look upon a most elegant small round hill, covered with wood, inimitably beautiful. This you also coast, nor can anything be more truly exquisite than these two slopes of wood, with beautiful enclosures between them, contrasting the sublimity of the rocks and mountains in the noblest style. Nor should you here forget to remark 3 or 4 enclosures on the other side of the lake, down to the water's edge, under Ackness Fell. They are exquisite. Sailing by some very beautiful grass enclosures, you catch a white house, romantically situated, and then skirting more enclosures, turn round a small but most exquisite promontory, with a sweet clump of trees on it. This leads into a very fine landlocked bay, which commands a beautiful sloping hanging wood, the scene enlivened by a white house, quite in the spot of taste. From hence you look over the lake upon Castlehead Crag, a fine round of rocky wood, rising out of a vale, and backed with waving enclosures. The shore from hence is most beautifully indented and irregular, running up among little hills finely fringed with wood. From hence you wind in and out of several bays and creeks, commanding very picturesque views of the land, and around a most noble hill of shrubby wood covered to the very top. From hence around the town the shore is flat. Your next view of Keswick must be from land, by walking up the vast rocks and crags first described. This is a journey which will terrify those who have been only used to flat countries. The walk to the highest rock is 1.5 miles up, and almost perpendicular, horribly rugged and tremendous. It is rather a climbing crawl than a walk. The path crossed the stream, which forms the first mentioned cascade, in the midst of dreadful cliffs and romantic hollows. The torrent roars beneath you, in some places seen, in others hid by rock and wood. From hence you climb through a slope of underwood to the edge of a precipice, from which you look down upon the lake and islands in a most beautiful manner, for coming at once upon them, after leaving a thick dark wood, the emotions of surprise and admiration are very great. Following the path, if it may be so called, you pass many romantic spots, and come to a projection of the hill, from which you look down, not only upon the lake as before, but also upon a semicircular vale of enclosures, of a most beautiful verdure, which gives a fine curve into the lake. One of the fields is scattered over with trees, which from hence have the most truly picturesque effect imaginable. Advancing further yet, you come to the head of Crastig Fall, which is a vast opening among these immense rocky mountains, that lets in between them a view across the lake, catching 2 of the islands, etc., in a most beautiful manner. Nor can anything be more horribly romantic than the adjoining ground where you command this sweet view. At last we gained the top of the crag, and from it the prospect is truly noble. You look down upon the lake, spotted with its islands, so far below as to appear in another region. The lower hills and rocks rise most picturesquely to the view. To the right you look down upon a beautiful vale of cultivated enclosures, whose verdure is painting itself. The town presents its scattered houses, among woods and spreading trees. Above it rises Skiddaw, cloud-topped in the most sublime magnitude. Descending to the town, we took our leave of this enchanting region of landscape, by scaling the formidable walls of Skiddaw himself. It is 5 miles to the top, but the immensity of the view fully repays for the labour of gaining it. You look upon the lake, which here appears no more than a little basin, and its islands but as so many spots. It is surrounded by a prodigious range of rocks and mountains, wild as the waves, sublimely romantic. These dreadful sweeps, the sport of nature in the most violent of her moments, are the most striking objects seen from Skiddaw, but in mere extent the view is prodigious. You see the hills in Scotland plainly, you view a fine reach of fen, command the Isle of Man, and see part of an object which I take to be an highland in Ireland, besides prodigious tracts of adjacent country. Keswick, upon the whole, contains a variety that cannot fail of astonishing the spectator. The lake, the islands, the hanging woods, the waving enclosures, and the cascades are all most superlatively elegant and beautiful, while the rocks, cliffs, crags, and mountains are equally terrifying and sublime. There cannot be a finer contrast, but it is much to be regretted that art does not yield more of her assistance, not in decoration, for the lake wants it not, but in enabling the spectator to command with greater ease the luxuriant beauties and striking views which to so many travellers are hitherto quite unknown. There are a vast many edges of precipices, bold projections of rock, pendant cliffs, and wild romantic spots, which command the most delicious scenes, but which cannot be reached without the most perilous difficulty. To such points of view, winding paths should be cut in the rock, and resting places made for the weary traveller. Many of these paths must necessarily lead through the hanging woods. Openings might be made to let in views of the lake, where the objects, such as islands, etc., were peculiarly beautiful. At the bottoms of the rocks, also, something of the same nature should be executed for better viewing the romantic cascades, which might be exhibited with a little art in a variety that would astonish. It is amusing to think of the pains and expense with which the environs of several seats have been ornamented, to produce pretty scenes it is true, but how very far short of the wonders that might here be held up to the eye in all the rich luxuriance of nature's painting. What are the effects of a Louis magnificence to the sportive play of nature in the vale of Keswick? How trifling the labours of art to the mere pranks of nature! Returning to Penrith, our next expedition was to Ullswater, a very fine lake, about 6 miles from that town. The approach to it is very beautiful. The most advantageous way of seeing it is to take the road up Dunmanlet Hill, for you rise up a very beautiful planted hill, and see nothing of the water till you gain the summit, when the view is uncommonly beautiful. You look down at once upon a sheet of the lake, which appears prodigiously fine. It is an oblong water, cut by islands 3 miles long, and 1.5 miles broad in some places, in others a mile. It is enclosed within an amphitheatre of hills, in front at the end of the reach, projecting down to the water edge, but retiring from it on each side, so as to leave a space of cultivated enclosures between the feet and the lake. The hedges that divide them are scattered with trees, and the fields of both grass and corn, waving in beautiful slopes from the water, intersected by hedges, in the most picturesque manner. Upon the right a bold swelling hill of turf rises with a fine air of grandeur. Another view from off this hill is on to a mountain side, which presents to the eye a swelling slope of turf, and over it Saddleback rises in a noble style. Another view from this hill is down upon a beautiful vale of cultivated enclosures. Mr. Hassell's house at Delmain, in one part, almost encompassed with a plantation. Here you likewise catch some meanders of the river through the trees, and hear the roar of a waterfall. This hill itself is a very fine object, viewed every way, but the simplicity of its effect is destroyed by being cut by a double stripe of Scotch firs across it, which varies the colour of the verdure, and consequently breaks the unity of the view. Another point of view from which this part of the lake is seen to good advantage is from off Solby Fell. You look down upon the water, which spreads very finely to the view, bounded to the right by the hills, which rise from the very water, at the other by Dunmanlet Hill, in front by a fine range of enclosures rising most beautifully to the view, and the water's edge skirted by trees, in a most picturesque manner. Directing your course under the lake, and landing at Swarth Fell, the next business should be to mount its height. The lake winds at your feet like a noble river, the opposite banks beautiful enclosures, exquisitely fringed with trees, and some little narrow slips, like promontories, jet into it with the most picturesque effect imaginable, and at the same time hear the noise of a waterfall beneath, but unseen. Taking boat again, and sailing with the course of the lake, you turn with its bend, and come into a very fine sheet of water, which appears like a lake of itself. It is under Howtown and Horling Fell. The environs here are very striking. Cultivated enclosures on one side, crowned with the tops of hills, and on the other a woody craggy hill down to the very water's edge, the effect fine. Next you double Horling Fell, and come again into a new sheet of water under Martindale Fell, which is a prodigious fine hill of a bold abrupt form, and between that and Howling Fell a little rising wave of cultivated enclosures, skirted with trees, the fields of the finest verdure, and the picturesque appearance of the whole most exquisitely pleasing. It is a most delicious spot, within an amphitheatre of rugged hills. Following the bend of the water under New Crag, the views are more romantic than in any part hitherto seen. New Crag to the right rears a bold, abrupt head in a style truly sublime, and passing it a little, the opposite shore is very noble. Martindale Fell rises steep from the water's edge, and presents a bold wall of mountain, really glorious. In front, the hills are craggy, broken, and irregular in shape, not height, like those of Keswick. They project so boldly to the very water that the outlet or wind of the water is shut by them from the eye. It seems enclosed by a shore of steep hills and crags. From hence to the edge of the lake, which there is sprinkled by 3 or 4 small islands, the views are in the same style, very wild and romantic. It is an exceedingly pleasing entertainment to sail about this fine lake, which is 19 miles round, and presents to the eye several very fine sheets of water, and abounds, for other amusement, with noble fish, pike to £30, perch to £6, trout to £6, besides many other sorts. The water is of a most beautiful colour, and admirably transparent. I took the opportunity of being at Shap to ride to Ullswater, a lake some miles to the westward. The road thither leads for some distance along the side of a hill, which commands an exceeding fine view of Ponton Vale to the left. It is several miles in length, of an oblong figure, all cut into enclosures of a charming verdure, and scattered in the most picturesque manner, with villages, clumps of wood, houses, bridges, trees, etc. A fine river takes the most beautiful serpentine course in the world through it. The opposite bank is a large ridge of mountain. It is a sweet landscape, which brings to one's imagination the idea of an Arcadian paradise. The approach to the lake is very picturesque. You pass between 2 high ridges of mountain, the banks finely spread with enclosures. Upon the right, 2 small beautiful hills, one of them covered with wood. They are most pleasingly elegant. The lake is a small one, about 3 miles long, half a mile over in some places, and a quarter in others, almost divided in the middle by a promontory of enclosures, joining only by a strait, so that it consists of 2 sheets of water. The upper end of it is fine, quite enclosed with bold, steep, craggy rocks and mountains, and in the centre of the end a few little enclosures, at their feet, waving upwards in a very beautiful manner. The south side of the lake is a noble ridge of mountain, very bold and prominent down to the water's edge. They bulge out in the centre in a fine, bold, pendant, broad head that is venerably magnificent, and the view of the first sheet of the lake losing itself into the second among hills, rocks, woods, etc., is picturesque. The opposite shore consists of enclosures, rising one above another and crowned with craggy rocks. 12 of the 15 miles from Shap to Kendal are a continued chain of mountainous moors, totally uncultivated. One dreary prospect that makes one melancholy to behold, for the soil itself is highly capable of cultivation and of profitable uses. Much of it is of a good depth, and the spontaneous growth proves that the very nature of the land is equal to many valuable uses. After crossing this dreary track, the first appearance of good country is most exquisitely fine. About 3 miles from Kendal, you at once look down from off this desolate country upon one of the finest landscapes in the world. A noble range of fertile enclosures, richly enamelled with the most beautiful verdure, and coming to the brow of the hill, have a most elegantly picturesque view of a variegated track of waving enclosures, spreading over hills and hanging to the eye in the most picturesque and pleasing manner that fancy can conceive. 3 hills in particular are overlooked, cut into enclosures in a charming style, of themselves forming a most elegant landscape, and worthy the imitation of those who would give the embellishments of art to the simplicity of nature. Kendal is a very plentiful and cheap place. Fat stubble geese are sold at 1 shillings and 4pence each, fat fowls at 1 shilling a couple, fat ducks the same price, wildfowl and game in great plenty, woodcocks often at 2pence a piece. Partridges are sold common in the market, and very cheap. Fish in great plenty, trout oftentimes at a penny a pound, besides many other sorts. It is a neat, well-built town. From hence we viewed the famous lake called Windermere, 10 miles west of Kendal. By much the longest water of the kind in England, it is 15 miles long, and from 2 miles to half a mile broad. It gives gentle bends, so as to present to the eye several noble sheets of water, and is in many places beautifully scattered with islands. The shores are nobly varied, consisting in some places of fine ridges of hills, in others of craggy rocks, in some of the waving enclosures, and in others of the finest hanging woods. Several villages and one market town are situated on its banks, and a ferry crosses it to another. There is some business carried on upon it, so that it is not uncommon to see barges with spreading sails. All these circumstances give it a very cheerful appearance, at the same time that they add to its beauty. I would advise those who view this lake not to take the common road down to the village of Bowness, where the boats are kept, but, for reasons which I shall hereafter add, to go thither round, almost by the ferry. The landlord at the inn at that village keeps a boat, and can always provide rowers for any company that comes. The extreme beauty of the lake induced me to explore every part of it with attention, but as I have already troubled you with several recitals of these water expeditions, I shall only mention a few of the principal points of view, and to which I should particularly recommend any traveller to row, if he had not time to view the whole lake. But no scheme of this sort can be more amusing than 2 or 3 days spent here in rowing, sailing, fishing, and wild duck shooting, all which are here to be had in great perfection, and I should add that the end of May or the beginning of June is the proper time for such an expedition. Taking boat at the village, you row first to the island, so called by way of pre-eminence, being by much the largest in the lake. It contains between 30 and 40 acres of land, and I cannot but think it the sweetest spot, and full of the greatest capabilities, of any 40 acres in the King's dominions. The view from the south end is very fine. The lake presents a most noble sheet of water stretching away for several miles, and bounded in front by distant mountains, the shores beautifully indented by promontories covered with wood, and jetting into the water in the most picturesque style imaginable, particularly the ferry points on both sides. It is broke by Berkshire Island, an elegant spot, finely wooded in one part, and by Craw Island, almost covered with wood in another, and just hides a house on the mainland. The eastern shore is spread forth with the most beautiful variety. In some places, waving enclosures of corn and grass rise one above another, and present to the eye a scenery beyond the brightest ideas of painting itself. In others, shrubby spots and pendant woods hang down to the very water's edge. In some places these woods are broke by a few small grass enclosures of the sweetest verdure, and in others run around large circuits of them, and, rising to the higher grounds, lose themselves in the wilds above. Here you see slips of land running into the lake and covered with trees, which seem to rise from the water. There a boldly indented shore, swelling into fine bays and skirted with spreading trees, an edging as elegant as ever fancied by Claude himself. The village is caught among some scattered trees, in a sweet situation, on the bank of a bay, followed by a promontory of wood. The background a sweep of enclosures rising one above another. Following this line of shore towards the north, you command Bannerig and Orest Head, 2 hills all cut into enclosures to the very top. To the north you look upon a noble range of irregular mountains, which contrast finely with the other more beautiful shores. The western is a fine sweep of craggy rocks, here and there fringed with wood. Advancing to the very farthest point of land, these objects are varied and new ones appear that are truly beautiful. The Lancashire ferry point and the woody island join, and seem one prodigious fine promontory of wood, the ferry house seen among the trees in a picturesque manner. They form the boundary in front of a fine bay, walled in to the right by a noble rocky cliff, and in the middle of it a sweet little woody island. Over the low part of the promontory the distant hills are seen finely. The shore to the left, here, appears peculiarly beautiful, for 6 enclosures of the most elegant verdure rise from the water's edge among sloping woods, and offer a variety of colours of the most picturesque hues. From hence likewise you look back on Bannerig, a fine cultivated hill, rising from the lake in a most pleasing manner. Moving from this end of the island along the west coast of it, the view is extremely picturesque. The strait is broke by 3 islands, 2 of them thickly covered with wood, the other a long slip, scattered with tall upright trees, through the stems of which, and under the thick shade of their spreading tops, the water is seen glittering with the sunbeams, a landscape truly delicious. From the north end of this isle, so happy in the beauties of prospect, the views are various, and some of them exquisite. Looking towards the south, you command a prodigious fine view of the lake, spreading to the right and left behind promontories, one beyond another, in a gloriously irregular sheet of water, encircled by an amphitheatre of hills, in the noblest style. To the north you look upon another sheet, different from the first. It is broke by a cluster of 4 small but beautiful islands. Full in front you look upon a noble sweep of mountains, and on one in particular that is very curious. It is of a circular form, rising out of a vast hollow among the rest, and is overtopped by them, romantic in the highest degree. A little to the right of it you command one of the most noble of cultivated hills. It is intersected by hedges, trees, and scattered woods, into a vast sweep of enclosures which reach the very top, a view beautifully magnificent. More to the right, the eye is delighted with the most elegant waves of cultivated enclosures that can be conceived, rising to the view in the most picturesque varieties of landscape, and forcing admiration from the most tasteless of mortals. To the left, a vast range of rocks and mountains form the boundary of the lake, and project into it in the boldest manner. Sailing from this noble island to that of Berkshire, a little hilly wood of scattered trees. The views are various, rich, and truly picturesque. From the north side of it you look upon a fine sheet of water, to the great island, etc., and bounded by a noble variety of shore. To the left and in front, high ridges of hills and mountains. To the right, most beautiful waving hills of enclosures, some just rising enough to show their hedges distinctly, and others hanging full to the eye. Beneath, a boundary of rough hills and wild, uncultivated ground. To the left you see Crow Island, which appears fine, and the ferry house beneath a clump of trees on the point of a promontory jetting into the water with an effect really exquisite. To the east you look against a very fine bank of enclosures, most elegantly scattered with trees. To the south the lake is lost between 2 promontories, projecting into it against each other, and leaving a fine strait between. One is high and rocky, the other a line of waving wood and enclosures, and catch beyond it the distant hills which complete the view. The western prospect is on to a range of craggy hills, some most beautifully fringed with hanging woods, and cut in the middle by a cultivated wave of enclosures, broken by woods, hedges, clumps, and scattered trees, and rising one above the other in the most picturesque irregularity that fancy can suppose. At the top a farmhouse, under a clump of trees, the whole forming a bird's-eye landscape of the most delicious kind. Nor can anything be finer than the hanging woods on this side of the lake, broken by grass enclosures of a beautiful verdure. Sailing across the lake from Berkshire to the shore under these enclosures, which are called Round Table, nothing in nature can be more exquisite than the view, as you move, of a fine, long grass enclosure at the water's edge, on the opposite shore, bounded by fine woods, except to the lake, edged with some spreading trees, through which the view of the grass is truly picturesque. Other waving slopes of enclosures to the right hang to the lake, under the shade of a rough, wild hill, and down to a skirting of wood on the water's edge, in the finest manner. Behind, the rocky cliff of Furness Fells has a noble appearance, crowned with a sweep of wood. Sailing under the western shore, you command most beautiful landscapes on the opposite one, consisting of the finest banks of cultivated enclosures, scattered with trees, clumps of wood, farmhouses, etc., and hanging to the water's edge in the most charming variety of situation, the fields in some places dipping in the very lake, in others thick woods rising from the water, scenes which call for the pencil of a genius to catch graces from nature beyond the reach of the most elaborate art. Coming to Lingholm, a small rocky island with a few trees on it, you have a double view of the 2 shores, finely contrasted. the western spread with noble hanging woods, and the eastern one cultivated hills, waving to the eye in the finest inequalities of surface. The distant hills are also seen in a bold style over the low enclosures of Rawlinson's Nab, a promontory to the south. Landing on the point of that promontory, the view is very noble. It commands two glorious sheets of water, north and south, each of 4 or 5 miles in length. That to the south is bounded in general by rough woody hills, broken in a few spots by little enclosures. In front of the promontory, several very beautiful ones, cut by irregular sweeps of wood, and hanging to the water's edge in the finest manner, the whole crowned with craggy tops of hills. But the view to the north is much the most beautiful. Berkshire Island breaks the sheet of water in one place, and adds to the picturesque variety of the scene without injuring its noble simplicity. Common Nab, a promontory from the east shore, projects into it in another place, elegantly variegated with wood and enclosures, waving over sloping hills and crowned with rough uncultivated ground. One enclosure in particular breaks into the wood in the most picturesque manner imaginable. This end of the lake is bounded by the noble hills of cultivated enclosures already mentioned, which are viewed from hence to much advantage. They rise from the shore with great magnificence. To the left a ridge of hanging woods spread over wild romantic ground, that breaks into bold projections, abrupt and spirited, contrasting the elegance of the opposite beautiful shore in the finest manner. Having thus viewed the most pleasing objects from these points, let me next conduct you to a spot where, at one glance, you command them all, in fresh situations, and all assuming a new appearance. For this purpose you return to the village, and taking the by-road to the turnpike, not that by which you came, mount the hill without turning your head. If I were your guide, I would conduct you behind a small hill, that you might come at once upon the view, till you almost gain the top, when you will be struck with astonishment at the prospect spread forth at your feet, which, if not the most superlative view that nature can exhibit, she is more fertile in beauties than the reach of my imagination will allow me to conceive. It would be mere vanity to attempt to describe a scene which beggars all description, but that you may have some faint idea of the outlines of this wonderful picture, I will just give the particulars of which it consists. The point on which you stand is the side of a large ridge of hills that form the eastern boundaries of the lake, and the situation high enough to look down upon all the objects, a circumstance of great importance, and which painting cannot imitate. In landscapes, you are either on a level with the objects or look up to them. The painter cannot give you the declivity at your feet, which lessens the objects as much in the perpendicular line as in his horizontal one. You look down upon a noble winding valley of about 12 miles long, everywhere enclosed with grounds which rise in a very bold and various manner, in some places bulging into mountains, abrupt, wild, and uncultivated, in others breaking into rocks, craggy, pointed, and irregular, here rising into hills covered with the noblest woods, presenting a gloomy brownness of shade, almost from the clouds to the reflection of the trees in the limpid water they so beautifully skirt. There, waving in glorious slopes of cultivated enclosures, adorned in the sweetest manner with every object that can give variety to art or elegance to nature, trees, woods, villages, houses, farms, scattered with picturesque confusion, and waving to the eye in the most romantic landscapes that nature can exhibit. This valley, so beautifully enclosed, is floated by the lake, which spreads forth to the right and left in one vast but irregular expanse of transparent water. A more noble object can hardly be imagined. Its immediate shore is traced in every variety of line that fancy can imagine, sometimes contracting the lake into the appearance of a noble winding river, at others retiring from it and opening large swelling bays as if for navies to anchor in. Promontories spread with woods or scattered with trees and enclosures, projecting into the water in the most picturesque style imaginable. Rocky points breaking the shore and rearing their bold heads above the water. In a word, a variety that amazes the beholder. But what finishes the scene with an elegance too delicious to be imagined, is this beautiful sheet of water being dotted with no less than 10 islands, distinctly commanded by the eye, all of the most bewitching beauty. The large one presents a waving various line, which rises from the water in the most picturesque inequalities of surface. High land in one place, low in another, clumps of trees in this spot, scattered ones in that, adorned by a farmhouse on the water's edge, and backed with a little wood, vying in simple elegance with Borromean palaces. Some of the smaller isles rising from the lake like little hills of wood, some only scattered with trees, and others of grass of the finest verdure, a more beautiful variety nowhere to be seen. Strain your imagination to command the idea of so noble an expanse of water thus gloriously environed, spotted with islands more beautiful than would have issued from the pencil of the happiest painter. Picture the mountains rearing their majestic heads with native sublimity, the vast rocks boldly projecting their terrible craggy points, and in the path of beauty the variegated enclosures of the most charming verdure, hanging to the eye in every picturesque form that can grace a landscape, with the most exquisite touches of la belle nature. If you raise your fancy to something infinitely beyond this assemblage of rural elegances, you may have a faint notion of the unexampled beauties of this ravishing landscape. End of Part 5. Part 6 of Early Guides to the English Lake District. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. An extract from a tour in Scotland, 1769, by Thomas Pennant. The country near Carlisle consists of small enclosures, but a little farther on, towards Penrith, changes into coarse downs. On the east, at a distance, are ridges of high hills running parallel to the road, with a good enclosed country in the intervening space. Above Penrith is a rich enclosed tract, mixed with hedgerow trees and woods. On the south-west, a prospect of high and craggy mountains. After I left Lockerbie, Nature, as if exhausted with her labours in the lofty hills of Scotland, seemed to have lain down and reposed herself for a considerable space, but here began to rise again, with all the sublimity of Alpine majesty. Penrith is an ancient town, seated at the foot of a hill, is a great thoroughfare for travellers, but has little other trade, except a small one of checks. The church is very neat, the gallery supported by large columns, each formed of a single stone. In the churchyard is a monument of great antiquity, consisting of 2 stone pillars 11 feet 6 inches high, and 5 in circumference in the lower part, which is rounded. The upper is square, and tapers to a point. In the square part is some fretwork, and the relievo of a cross. Both these stones are mortified at their lower part into a round one. They are about 15 feet asunder. The space between them is enclosed on each side with 2 very large but thin semicircular stones, so that there is left a walk between pillar and pillar of 2 feet in breadth. 2 of these lesser stones are plain, the other 2 have certain figures at present scarce intelligible. Cross the Emot, a small river, and soon after the Lowther over Yeoman's Bridge, near which I enter Westmoreland. About 4 miles further, cross Clifton Moor, where the rebels made a short stand in 1745, and sacrificed a few men to save the rest of their army. Pass over Shap Fells, more black, dreary, and melancholy than any of the Highland hills, being not only very barren, but destitute of every picturesque beauty. This barren scene continued to within a small distance of Kendal, a large town on the river Kent, in a rich and beautiful vale, well cultivated and prettily wooded. Here is a very great trade in knit worsted stockings, some linseys, and a coarse sort of cloth called cottons, for the guinea trade. Near Burton enter Lancashire, reach its capital Lancaster after a large and well-built town, seated on the Lune, a river navigable for ships of 250 tons as high as the bridge. The custom house is a small but most elegant building, with a portico supported by 4 Ionic pillars on a beautiful plain pediment. There is a double flight of steps, a rustic surbase and coins, a work that does much credit to Mr. Gillow, the architect, an inhabitant of this town. The church is seated on an eminence, and commands an extensive but not a pleasing view. The castle is entire, the courts of justice are held in it, and it is also the county jail. The front is very handsome, consists of 2 large angular towers, with a handsome gateway between. End of Part 6. Part 7 of Early Guides to the English Lake District. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Ode to the Sun by Mr. Cumberland, 1776. Soul of the world, refulgent sun, O take not from my ravished sight those golden beams of living light, nor, ere thy daily course be run, precipitate the night. Lo, where the ruffian clouds arise, usurp the abdicated skies, and seize the ethereal throne. Sullen, sad, the scene appears, huge Helvellyn streams with tears. Hark, 'tis giant Skidaw's groan. I hear terrific Lodore roar. The Sabbath of thy reign is o'er, the anarchy's begun. Father of light, return, break forth, refulgent sun. What if the rebel blast shall rend these nodding horrors from the mountain's brow? Hither thy glad deliverance send, and save the votarist and accept the vow. And say, through thy diurnal round, where, great spectator, hast thou found such solemn, soul-inviting shades, ghostly dells, religious glades, where penitence may plant its meek abode, and hermit meditation meet its God? Now by the margin of yon glassy deep my pensive vigils let me keep, there by force of runic spells shake the grot where nature dwells, and in the witching hour of night, whilst thy pale sister lends her shadowy light, summon the naked wood-nymphs to my sight. Trembling now with giddy tread, press the moss on Gaudar's head, but lo, where sits the bird of Jove, couched in his eyrie far above? O lend thine eye, thy pinion lend, higher, yet higher let me still ascend. 'Tis done, my forehead smites the skies, to the last summit of the cliff I rise. I touch the sacred ground, where step of man was never found. I see all nature's rude domain around. Peace to thy empire, queen of calm desires. Health crown thy hills, and plenty robe thy vales. May thy groves wave untouched by wasteful fires, nor commerce crowd thy lakes with sordid sails. Press not so fast upon my aching sight, gigantic shapes, nor rear your heads so high, as if ye meant a war against the sky. Sons of old chaos and primeval night, such were the heights enshrined Bruno trod, when on the cliff he hung his towering cell, amongst the clouds aspired to dwell, and half ascended to his God. The prim canal, the level green, the close-clipped hedge that bounds the flourished scene, what rapture can such forms impart, with all the spruce impertinence of art? Ye pageant streams that roll in state by the vain windows of the great, rest on your muddy ooze, and see old majestic Derwent force his independent course, and learn of him and nature to be free. And you, triumphal arches, shrink, ye temples tremble, and ye columns sink. One nod from Wallow's craggy brow shall crush the dome of sacerdotal Rome, and lay her glittering gilded trophies low. Now downward as I bend my eye, what is that atom I espy, that speck in nature's plan? Great heaven! Is that a man? And hath that little wretch its cares, its freaks, its follies, and its airs? And do I hear the insect say, my lakes, my mountains, my domain? O weak, contemptible, and vain, the tenant of a day! Say to old Skiddaw, change thy place, heave Helvellyn from his base, or bid impetuous Derwent stand at the proud waving of a master's hand. Now with silent step and slow descend, but first forbear to blow, ye felon winds. Let discord cease, and nature seal an elemental peace. Hush, not a whisper here, beware, for Echo on the watch sits with erect and listening ear, the secrets of the scene to catch. Then swelling as she rolls around the hoarse reverberated sound, with loud repeated shocks she beats the loose impending rocks, tears down the fragments big with death, and hurls it thundering on the wretch beneath. Not so the Naiad, she defies the faithless Echo, and with yelling cries howls on the summit of rude Lodor's brow, then with a desperate leap springs from the rocky steep, and runs enamoured to the lake below. So the Cambrian minstrel stood, bending o'er old Conway's flood, white as foam his silver beard, and loud and shrill his voice was heard. All the while down Snowdon's side, winding slow in dread array, he saw the victor king pursue his way, then, fearless, rushed into the foaming tide, cursed him by all his idol gods, and died. Ah, where is he that swept the founding lyre, and while he touched the master string, bade ruin seize the ruthless king, with all the prophet's fire? Mourn him, ye Naiads, and ye wood nymphs mourn, but chiefly ye, who rule o'er Keswick's vale, your visitor bewail, and pluck fresh laurels for his hallowed urn. He saw your scenes in harmony divine, on him indulgent suns could shine, me turbid skies and threatening clouds await, emblems, alas, of my ignoble fate. But see the embattled vapours break, disperse and fly, posting like couriers down the sky, the grey rock glitters in the glassy lake, and now the mountain tops are seen, frowning amidst the blue serene, the variegated groves appear, decked in the colours of the waning year, and, as new beauties they unfold, dip their skirts in beaming gold. Thee, savage Wyburn, now I hail, delicious Grasmere's calm retreat, and stately Windermere I greet, and Keswick's sweet fantastic vale. But let her Naiads yield to thee, and lowly bend the subject knee, imperial lake of Patrick's dale, for neither Scottish lowman's pride, nor smooth Killarney's silver tide, nor aught that learned Poussin drew, or dashing Rosa flung upon my view, shall shake thy sovereign undisturbed right, great scene of wonder and sublime delights. Hail to thy beams, O sun, for this display! What glorious orb can I repay? Not Memnon's costly shrine, nor the white coursers of imperial Rome, nor the rich smoke of Persia's hecatomb. Such proud oblations are not mine, nor thou my simple tribute shall refuse, the thanks of an unprostituted muse. And may no length of still returning day strike from thy forehead one refulgent ray, but let each tuneful, each attendant sphere, to latest time thy stated labours cheer, and with new paeans crown the finished year. End of Part 7. End of Early Guides to the English Lake District.